She had 6 weeks. She had spent 3 of them getting strong enough to sit upright for 2 hours. Her one request, written in a letter her daughter sent to The Tonight Show, was to be in the audience one last time. What Carson did when he read that letter, and what he did differently on the night of April 11, 1978, was something the production staff talked about for the rest of their careers. The letter arrived at NBC Burbank on a Tuesday morning in late February. It was written by a woman named Susan Calloway, 34 years old, on behalf of her mother Dorothy, who was 61 and had been living with pancreatic cancer since the previous October. The oncologists had given Dorothy an updated prognosis in January. The disease had progressed beyond the range where intervention offered meaningful probability of change, and the conversation had shifted from treatment to timeline. The timeline they gave her was 6 to 8 weeks. Dorothy had watched The Tonight Show every weeknight for 19 years. She had started watching in 1959 when it was hosted by Jack Parr and had continued through the transition to Carson in 1962 and had not missed a weeknight taping in the 17 years since. It was not a habit or a routine for her. It was something more deliberate than that. She had described it to Susan over the years as the thing that ended the day properly, the thing that put a frame around whatever the day had been and gave it a conclusion before sleep. She had said once, in the specific way that people sometimes articulate things they have never articulated before when the occasion for it unexpectedly presents itself, that the sign-off was what she waited for. Not the monologue or the guests or the comedy, though she valued all of those. The sign-off. The moment at the end when Carson looked at the camera in the way he did, the real way, not the broadcast way, and said goodnight. She had said, "It always feels like he means me specifically. I know that's not possible, but it always feels that way." Susan had written the letter because Dorothy had said, in a conversation in late February, that the one thing she wanted before the disease made it impossible was to be in the studio audience once more. Not to meet Carson, not to be on the show, simply to be in the room where the thing happened, to see from the inside the physical reality of the place that had been giving her days their endings for 19 years. Susan had written to the show without expecting anything specific. She had provided Dorothy's diagnosis and timeline and her mother's 19 years of watching and the one request, and she had written it clearly and without embellishment and had sent it to the address listed on the NBC website and had not expected to hear back for several weeks, if at all. Patricia Vargas had the letter on Carson's desk within 40 minutes of its arrival. Carson read it that afternoon. He read it the way he read the letters that Vargas flagged as requiring his direct attention, carefully, completely, and with the notepad on the desk beside him that he used for the thoughts that arrived during the reading. The notepad had several items on it when he finished. He called Vargas in and gave her specific instructions that took 8 minutes to deliver and that required her to contact the production department, the scheduling office, and 2 of the week's confirmed guests before the end of the day. The instructions were, in summary, these. Dorothy Calloway was to be given 2 tickets for the April 11th taping, the best seats in the house, center section, close enough to see the stage clearly without straining. The running order for April 11th was to be restructured so that the final segment of the evening, the last 15 minutes, would be different from anything the show had done before. Carson would handle the content of those 15 minutes himself. Nobody was to inform Dorothy or Susan that anything had been changed on her behalf. Nobody was to tell them before or during the taping that Carson knew she was there. What Carson had in mind for the final 15 minutes took him 3 evenings to prepare. He did not discuss it with the writing staff. He did not show a draft to the production team. He sat at his desk at home on 3 consecutive evenings and worked through what he wanted to say with the specific thoroughness he brought to things that mattered to him in a way that was private rather than professional. Slowly, with revisions, arriving at something that was true rather than something that was polished. Dorothy and Susan arrived at NBC Burbank on the evening of April 11th. Dorothy was in a wheelchair. The 3 weeks of gathering strength had produced enough stability for the drive and the taping, but not for extended walking. And Susan had arranged the wheelchair with the practical efficiency of a daughter who had spent 5 months becoming an expert in the logistics of her mother's illness. They were met at the entrance by a member of the audience coordination staff who had been specifically briefed, took them to their seats in the center section of the fourth row, and ensured that Dorothy's wheelchair was positioned so that her sight line to the stage was unobstructed. Dorothy had not been told about any of this. She had been told that her request had been granted and that 2 tickets would be waiting at the entrance. She understood this as a standard accommodation and had accepted it with the specific gratitude of someone who is not accustomed to requests being met and is trying not to make too much of the meeting. She did not know that Carson had read her daughter's letter. The first hour and 20 minutes of the April 11th taping were the standard Tonight Show. The monologue, 2 guest segments, a comedy piece that ran 4 minutes. By every external measure, it was a good show, running smoothly at the quality level that the production staff recognized as optimal. Nothing in those 80 minutes indicated that anything was different about this particular Tuesday night. Then, the final segment began. Carson did not introduce it. He did not tell the audience what was about to happen or why. He simply paused at the desk in the way he paused before the sign-off, with the specific quality of stillness that his staff recognized as the real thing rather than the performed thing, and he began to talk. He talked for 15 minutes about what the show meant. Not in the abstract, not in the general terms of an anniversary reflection or a career retrospective, but specifically what it meant to come into a room every night for 22 years and talk to people who were not there, to the 14 million people at home who were ending their days by turning on the television and watching someone they had never met exist in a room in Burbank. He talked about what he understood that to be, from his end, the responsibility of it, the specific weight of being the last voice someone heard before they went to sleep, not always, not for everyone, but for enough people that you knew it was happening, that somewhere in the 14 million there were people for whom the show was the closing bracket of the day and whose days you were there for, in some small but specific way, participating in. He said, "I think about those people. I have always thought about them, the ones who turn the television off when I say goodnight and then the room is dark and that's the end of the day. I know they're there. I've always known." He paused. The studio was so quiet that the floor manager, standing at the edge of the set, said afterward he could hear the ventilation system. He said, "Tonight I want to say goodnight to someone specifically. Someone who has been ending her days this way for 19 years. I don't know her. She doesn't know I know she's here, but she is, and I want her to know that the 19 years were felt on this end. That it wasn't just a broadcast going out into a dark room. That someone on this side knew the days were being ended this way, and was glad for it, and will be glad for it after tonight." He said it at the volume of normal conversation. He said it without looking at his note card. He had not used a note card since the first minute of the 15. He looked at the audience in the specific way he looked at it during the sign-off, directly, personally, as though the 14 million people at home and the 400 people in the room were each individually present to him. He said, "Good night, Dorothy." Susan Calloway, in the fourth row center, put her hand over her mouth. Dorothy, beside her in the wheelchair, looked at the stage with an expression that Susan would spend years trying to describe to people who asked. The closest she ever came was the expression of someone who has just been told that the thing they thought was private was seen, not exposed, seen. The difference mattered enormously to Susan, and she always made sure people understood the distinction. The studio was silent for 4 seconds after the words. Then the audience applauded, not the reflex applause of people following a cue, but the sustained warm applause of 400 people who had just witnessed something they understood was real and were expressing, in the only way available to them, that they had received it. The April 11th taping aired as it happened. The 15 minutes at the end ran in full, without editorial comment or contextual explanation. The broadcast received more viewer mail than any Tonight Show episode that year. Most of the letters said some version of the same thing, that it had felt personal, that they had felt addressed directly, that the good night at the end had felt like it was meant for them specifically. It was. It was meant for all of them, the way it had always been meant for all of them, but with the additional specific weight of being meant for one person in particular that night, one person in the fourth row who had been ending her days this way for 19 years and had come to see it from the inside one last time. She died at home, with Susan beside her, in the early morning hours before the day had fully arrived. Susan said afterward that the final weeks had been different from the months before, that Dorothy had been peaceful in a specific way that hadn't always been present, and that she had watched The Tonight Show every night she was able to, and that on several of those nights she had said quietly, to the television or to the room or to no one in particular, that the good night felt different now. Meant. Susan had not told her mother about Carson's letter or about the instructions he had given before the taping. Dorothy had understood on her own what had happened. She had felt the room in the way that Dorothy Calloway, who had been ending her days this way for 19 years, could feel a room. She knew she had been seen. That was what Susan told Carson in the letter she wrote the following week. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first described Dorothy's last weeks, that she had been peaceful in a way she had not always been in the months before, and that she had watched The Tonight Show every night that she was able to, and that she had said on several of those nights that the good night felt different now, like it was meant. The second paragraph was a single sentence. She knew you saw her. That was the whole thing. She knew, Carson wrote back. 3 sentences. He said that he was sorry for her loss. He said that Dorothy's 19 years had been felt on his end, every one of them, whether or not that had been visible. He said, "The room is never as dark as it seems from the outside." Susan kept the letter. She read it on difficult nights for the rest of her life, not because it contained information she needed, but because it said something true about a thing that was important to her, in the specific language of someone who had actually thought about it rather than someone performing the thinking. The April 11th taping aired as it happened. Carson's 15 minutes at the end ran in full, without editorial comment or contextual explanation. The broadcast received more viewer mail than any Tonight Show episode that year. Most of the letters said some version of the same thing, that it had felt personal, that they had felt addressed directly, that the good night at the end had felt like it was meant for them specifically. It was. It was meant for all of them, the way it had always been meant for all of them, but with the specific weight of being meant for one person in particular that night. One person in the 4th row who had been ending her days this way for 19 years and had come to see it from the inside one last time. The room is never as dark as it seems from the outside. 3 words, said by a man who had been in the lit room for 22 years, saying goodnight into the dark, and meaning it. Every night, for every person who was out there in it, turning off the light when he said the word. If this story reminded you that being seen, truly seen by one person once, can be enough to carry a person through whatever comes next, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more untold stories about the legends behind the television, and leave a comment about a moment when someone saw you and it changed everything. Susan kept Carson's reply letter. She read it on difficult nights for the rest of her life, not because it contained information she needed, but because it said something true in the language of someone who had actually thought about it. The room is never as dark as it seems from the outside. 3 sentences in a letter, 3 words that mattered most, said by a man who'd been in the lit room for 22 years, saying goodnight into the dark every night, not as a broadcast formality, as a genuine acknowledgement, addressed to the 14 million, and on April 11th, 1978, addressed to one of them by name. He had read Susan's letter on a Tuesday afternoon and had known immediately that the 19 years deserved something more than a ticket to a taping. The Dorothy Calloway, who had been trusting the show to end her days properly for 19 years, deserved to know that the trust had been felt. He gave her 3 evenings of preparation and 15 minutes of airtime and 2 words at the end. "Good night, Dorothy." That was the whole of it, said directly, by name, into a room where she was sitting. Said by the person who had been saying it generally for 17 years, now saying it specifically, because she had come to hear it one last time, and he had decided that if she was in the room, she deserved to know she was in the room. The room is never as dark as it seems from the outside. If this story reminded you that being truly seen by one person once can carry someone through whatever comes next, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more untold stories about the legends behind the television, and leave a comment about a moment when someone saw you and it changed everything.